the introduction of joint custody in May 2024 ended up being a hollow reform. Rather than becoming the principle, joint custody was made optional, only permitted when both parents agree. If they disagree, the court steps in, and in cases of parental conflict, sole custody is often granted. Even if granted, the court can strip custody out from parental authority. With such a fragile form of custody, co-parenting becomes an unattainable dream. Furthermore, no explicit penalties were introduced for child abduction by one parent. In practice, Japan's sole custody has just dressed up with the illusion of joint custody. So why was the reform so thoroughly watered down? The answer lies in the coordinated efforts of the Red Network, the judges, and ruling party lawmakers. This video will explain clearly how they work together to dilute the reform. First, let me begin with the Red Network. The Red Network refers to a close-knit network of former radical activists, once part of far-left violent groups such as Fourth International and other resonating extreme leftists. Feature of Red Network. A key characteristic of the Red Network is that it is not a fixed organization composed of members from a single body. In normal times, they spread out and engage separately in various leftist activities. But during times of crisis, they rally together, form a tight network, achieve their goals, and then melt away again. This repeated cycle of gathering and dispersing creates an organically connected, fluid network. Ideology of the Red Network. Because members join together based on shared interests, the group's ideology can vary depending on who's involved. However, two core elements consistently surface: Marxist socialism and North Korean-style state control. Marxism was core belief of radical groups like Revolutionary Marxist and Revolutionary Communist, who in 1970s tried to turn Japan into a socialist state through violent protests and guerrilla warfare. Marx viewed capitalism as a system in which capitalists, who owned the means of production such as factories, dominated hired workers. He conceived socialism as a society that would liberate workers from capitalist control. As a means of achieving this, he advocated the violent slogan, "Seize the factories from the capitalists through revolution." Since Red Network is deeply rooted in Marxist thought, it habitually frames society as a power structure where the strong dominate the weak. In men and women's case, men sexually abusing women. In husband and wife's case, husbands harassing wives. In families' case, fathers abusing mothers and children. To establish these power dynamics, the language of exploit are often used. Built into the system is always a way for individuals to save themselves, what Marx called revolution, that enables individuals to destroy others. Between men and women, claims of non-consensual sex. Between husband and wife, claims of psychological domestic violence. Among families, child abduction under the pretext of escaping abuse. No proof needed. Just your feelings are enough to blow up the relationship and bury the other party alive. Ultimately, Marxist thinking leads to a North Korean model of national governance. To control the people absolutely, as in North Korea, the state must weaken family bonds. Because family loyalty often resists state authority when the two are in conflict. As a result, efforts have been made in North Korea to weaken family ties. This weakening was achieved through policies like gender equality framed as women's liberation from the household and maternal protection, and children's rights framed as protection from abusive parents and providing free education. By stepping in as the guardian of women and children, husbands become unnecessary, minimized mutual support within families, dismantled family unity into mere collections of individuals, allowing state control to extend directly to each citizen. Japan is seeing the same trend: toothless joint custody after divorce, child abduction during marriage, all justified under the guise of protecting mothers and children, while systematically tearing families apart. Now they're targeting separate surnames at marriage. If implemented, it means families are dismantled throughout the entire duration of marriage, laying the groundwork for North Korean-style state control. The profile of Red Network's members. Members of the Red Network are typically individuals who were involved in student activism during the 1970s, meaning most are now around 70s. Given their involvement in socialist ideologies and North Korean-style governance, many have roots in Korean descent. And since protection of women is used as a tool to push family fragmentation, they often align with feminists and other peripheral leftist movements, makes them women. The reason Japan's feminist arguments have significantly deviated from women's social participation, leaning instead toward excessive female privilege and misandry, is because they are manipulated by Red Network. The threat of the Red Network. In the past, they were nothing more than violent protesters or guerrilla actors, posing no real threat of socialist revolution. But today, things are different. They've taken off their helmets, donned the mask of liberalism, and swapped Molotov cocktails for smartphones, changed their battlefield to Nagatachio, and quietly, yet steadily, pushing forward a socialist revolution becoming a serious threat. How Red Network infiltrates Nagatachio. There are two main infiltration strategies. One is by being appointed as a member of government advisory committees, and the other is by establishing NPOs for the week. Let's begin with committee members' appointments. Typically, when a new law is being considered, the relevant ministry forms a committee of experts to discuss and draft a proposal. Once the committee finalizes its recommendations, the ministry drafts the bill, which is then submitted to the Diet for deliberation and ultimately enacted into law. However, if all political parties agree to a bill, it can bypass debate in the Diet and be enacted immediately. This fast-track process is where the Red Network exploits its leverage. Specifically, left-wing parties sympathetic to the Red Network shows an attitude of objection towards the bill, unless members of the Red Network are included in the committee. The ruling party, eager to pass as many bills as possible within the limited Diet session, caves to this demand and allows Red Network in. Once inside, the Red Network begin promoting far-left ideology as if staging a protest, disrupt proceedings, hijack the committee, and extract concessions. That's how Red Network insert their radical ideas into the drafted bills, and their ideal laws are enacted without proper debate in the Diet. The second method is infiltration through NPOs for the week. Members of the Red Network disguise themselves as liberal activists and form NPOs that claim to support disadvantaged groups. However, their true aim is to pocket government subsidies earmarked to help the fabricated victims they created. And subsidies to large NPOs may even reach up to billions of yen. These funds not only finance their far-left activities, but also quickly transforms public funds seeker into a strong voter base for left-wing parties, with some even making political donations, thus expanding their influence over politicians. The Democratic Party's slogan, "From concrete to people," significantly shifted the flow of public funds. Combined with global trends toward liberalism and diversity, it has become even easier to secure funding for vulnerable. As a result, not only left-wing parties, but also profit-driven politicians from conservative parties have flocked to these opportunities, expanding their political influence. These two strategies, committee appointments and NPOs, can be repeated alternately, allowing the Red Network's presence to expand indefinitely, posing a significant risk. Here's how it works. First, they get themselves appointed as a committee member and create far-left legislation that channels public funds to their own NPO. They then return to their NPO, receive public funds, strengthen their political influence through voter mobilization and political donations, and are once again selected as committee members. By repeating this cycle indefinitely, they ultimately amass overwhelming influence over politicians. Joint custody for Red Network. For the Red Network, which seeks to dismantle families and establish direct state control over individuals, sole custody was ideal. Joint custody, which preserves some semblance of a family unit, is inconvenient. Even North Korea maintains a sole custody model, and preserving that model in Japan was a top priority for them. However, reform for joint custody couldn't bypass debates in Diet, making it difficult to infiltrate the committee using the usual methods. And that's when white knights stepped in to assist the Red Network. It was the corrupt judges. Now let's take a closer look at why the judges chose to help the Red Network, and exactly how they did it. To understand the intentions and tactics of corrupt judges, we must first examine Japan's separation of powers. The current form of separation of powers was incorporated into the Constitution in 1947, response to the military's unchecked rampage under concentrated power during the war. Thus, governmental power was divided into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, and allocated respectively to the Diet, the Cabinet, and the courts, establishing a system of mutual checks to prevent the abuse of power. However, soon after the war, the balance began to erode when a system of judge-prosecutor exchange was introduced in which judges were seconded to the Ministry of Justice due to a lack of civil law experts. When it first started, approximately 10 judges were seconded on an emergency basis. But as the system became institutionalized, the number of judges increased significantly. Today, that number has reached as many as 150. And at the Ministry of Justice, where they are seconded, astonishingly, a judge seconded to the Ministry of Justice is put in charge of the Civil Affairs Bureau, the very division that controls the civil code shaping the daily lives of the Japanese people. This means that judges are now free to make the rules and judge the people as they please. The boundary between lawmaking and judging has vanished, and the fundamental system of checks and balances between the legislative, judicial, and executive branches has collapsed. And just like during wartime Japan, unchecked power is now centralized and running rampant, only this time in the courts. Committee for Corrupt Judges. Committees under the Ministry of Justice are supposed to be forums to discuss and develop the most appropriate laws for the public. However, for corrupt judges, it is rather opportunities to shape laws that benefit the judiciary. In fact, for Ministry of Justice officials who participated in the Family Law Reform Committee, either as members or as staff, were all undercover judges seconded to the ministry. Combined with 3 official judges and 1 more undercover judge from other ministry, judges made up to 8, accounting for roughly 20% of 37 committee members, becoming the largest single bloc. Unsurprisingly, discussions proceeded in favor of the judiciary. In fact, toothless joint custody enacted in 2024 was a carbon copy of what a corrupt judge, then serving as Director General of the Civil Affairs Bureau, described in a 2019 diet session as an image of joint custody, even before the committee was formed in 2021. The content was parenting by just one parent, custody rights only for major decisions, and visitation merely encouraged, such a masterclass dilution. In reality, the committee was nothing more than an elaborate charade designed to give the illusion that decisions had been made through discussions among representatives of the people. Intention of corrupt judges. So then why in the world do these corrupt judges want to dilute joint custody? That is because they don't want to change their current, highly simplified court procedures. In practice, the current process simply checks whether the parents are living separately and then automatically assigns custody to the residential parent if separated, and to the mother if not. The court puts itself first, and even when a child's best interest clearly calls for case-by-case evaluation, the system blocks it and continues its mindless routine. If joint custody were adopted and courts had to prioritize the child's best interests, they could no longer sweep individual circumstances under the rug. The easy assembly line flow would fall apart, and suddenly judges would have to make real decisions, take responsibility, and actually work, instead of just rubber stamping whatever comes across their desks. The solution is straightforward. Just add more judges to handle the growing workload. However, these judges, proud of being part of a privileged few, refuse it from happening, fearing that it would dilute their precious authority. And of course, they're not about to handle more work themselves. So instead, they chose the easy way out, a hollowed-out version of joint custody that lets them keep the easy assembly line flow. That's when they turned their attention to the Red Network. They knew that once Red Network are involved, they do what they always do: shout extreme leftist rhetoric, stalling discussions on joint custody, and ultimately extract concessions to toothless joint custody. And so the Red Network boldly walked through the front door, formally invited, to insert itself into the Family Law Reform Committee on joint custody. However, even with the help of sympathetic judges, they couldn't pass a toothless joint custody law on their own. The final push came from ruling party lawmaker. Initially, ruling party lawmakers seemed proactive about introducing joint custody in principle. But as the committee discussions progressed, their stance hardened. First, the word in principle was quietly dropped from joint custody. And by the end, they were actively parading the ministry's toothless version as if it were genuine joint custody. Then why on earth did the ruling party switch sides halfway through? Once again, the Red Network was at play. The Red Network didn't just infiltrate the committee and set it ablaze with their radicalism, they also teamed up with fellow leftist activists on the outside to launch massive theatrical protests. Since they framed joint custody as a threat of continued domestic violence of abusive husbands, they joined forces with DV survivor groups, single mother support organizations, and feminists. What's more, since sole custody divorce cases were a lucrative business to many lawyers, they aligned with the Japanese Federation of Bar Associations and left-leaning human rights lawyers. Because these NPOs and advocacy groups keep lawmakers in their pocket through steady donations and vote blocks, it appears that a political calculation of securing a majority for joint custody in principle is difficult, has emerged during the process. In fact, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, a strong proponent of joint custody, grew suspicious of a ruling party lawmaker's ambiguous stance. He summoned him to his office and reportedly asked,
"I've heard you're overly mindful of the Bar Association and cozying up to the Ministry of Justice. Is that true?"
In response, the ruling party lawmaker exclaimed,
"Absolutely not. That's completely untrue."
Visibly flustered and desperately denied it, but this ruling party lawmaker was originally a lawyer and entered politics with the support of the Japan Federation of Bar Associations. And after Shinzo Abe was tragically assassinated, the ruling party saw an opportunity. Passing the ministry's toothless joint custody could still be touted as progress. On top of that, it was a golden chance to score points, not just with the Red Network, but with the courts too. Far from killing 2 birds with 1 stone, they hit 3, and the hollow version of joint custody was enacted. As you can see, global standard joint custody, meant to save Japanese families from heartbreaking separation, was crushed to protect the judiciary's convenience. Judges are a disgraceful breed, willing to let the public suffer just so they can remain aloof and comfort. While judicial decay is alarming enough, equally concerning are the conflicts of interest within committees and NPOs' misuse of public funds, both leading to growing influence of Red Network. If we truly want to fix these injustices and put Japan back on a sound path, at the very least, the following measures must be put in place. First, ensuring the fairness of committee appointments. Legal mandates should require screening for conflicts of interest when selecting committee members. Anyone who would directly benefit from a proposed law must be excluded to guarantee impartial discussions. Second, ensuring transparency in public funding. NPOs and groups that receive public money must be subject to mandatory audits to prevent misuse and block any illegal kickbacks to politicians. And finally, real separation of powers. Ban judge-prosecutor exchange immediately. Kick judges out of the Justice Ministry. Only then can we break the toxic overlap and get the legislative and judicial branches truly independent. Only by enforcing these reforms can we break the current dysfunction, so that the Justice Ministry finally starts debating laws for the people, the Diet enacts them properly, and Japan can at last adopt true joint custody that lets children live with both parents.